Thank you very much, Prof. And of course, thank you all for coming. How wonderful it is to see such a good audience here and some wonderful familiar faces. And I do want to acknowledge and to thank the Peter Wall Institute for hosting this event, and of course Janice Sarah and her remarkable team of advisors for their support of the African Storybook Project, which has really helped it to grow in very important ways. I do also want to acknowledge that I stand as a guest on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I'm also happy to say that part of the African Storybook Project has been to make connections with First Nations communities in northern Canada. So I'm very excited about that development. So the topic, the African Storybook Project, what questions for research? So the structure of my presentation: what problem is the African Storybook Project trying to solve? And why now? What is the significance about the current timing? What are the key features of the African Storybook Project? And also, why research leadership from UBC, which is actually quite a long way away from the African continent? And very importantly, what are the questions for research? So let's begin with the problem that we are trying to resolve. The Education for All Global Monitoring Report for 2013-2014 just came out last week, and the results are very troubling. I just want to take you through a couple of statistics. What we're looking at is the finding many children in the poorest countries are not learning the basics. So what does that mean? If you have a look at this image, the pencil demonstrates those who have been successful globally by grade 4. Those who are in grade 4, reach grade 4 but have learned very little, and those who are not even in grade 4. Now, the summary, and we can talk about the statistics in more detail if we have time in the Q&A, but 96% of children in North America stay in school till grade 4 and achieve minimum standards. So that's really the pencil here at the bottom. Whereas 40% of children in sub-Saharan Africa stay in school till grade 4 and achieve minimum standards. So that there we have here, sub-Saharan Africa. And very interesting, you'll see that a good number of kids do stay in school, probably over 60%, but in fact are not learning the basics. And many are in fact not in school at all. As a global community, this is something we need to be concerned about. And if you think that the Millennium Development Goals, the targets are due for the Millennium Development Goals next year, what does this mean for where we stand in relation to our global commitment to educational change globally in the world, but also in Africa particularly? Let's have a look at some more startling statistics. The issue being that poor quality education leaves a legacy of illiteracy. So 1/4 of those aged 15 to 24 in poor countries are unable to read a single sentence. We need to be concerned about these results, and there are others that are also significant that we can come back to. Now, when it comes to saying, okay, people cannot read a single sentence, so what is the role of mother tongue literacy? There is ample research showing that students are quicker to learn to read and acquire other academic skills when first taught in their mother tongue. They also learn a second language more quickly than those initially taught to read in an unfamiliar language. So mother tongue literacy is very important for learning, not only the first language, but also the second language. And this is a report from UNICEF in 1999. But we do have in Canada here, Jim Cummins has done remarkable work in this area of research, and his work is often cited in support of this finding. Bottom line, there are few books available in the mother tongue. So if we have a look here, I'm going to share with you a short video. Some of you may have seen it, a video that was created about the African Storybook Project based on a colloquium that was done in October. And I'm going to share that. I'm not going to play the whole video, just a 2-minute clip to give you just a sense of some of the key stakeholders.
nutshell, what we're trying to do in the African Storybook is to say, how can we ensure that there are many wonderful stories for parents to read to children, for children to read in libraries, for librarians to read to children, to teachers to work with children, and how can we make sure that there are enough of those in local languages?
The African Storybook Project is about promoting literacy for African children, predominantly in the mother tongue. And the best way that kids can learn a language, become literate, is through the mother tongue.
It's mainly about access, because access is not only going to be confined into a classroom, it's also going to be at home. They can access the stories from home. So even if they are not being taught at school their home languages, they can access them from home through, our website, and learning in their own pace, at their own time, the stories that they've heard from their parents or from their great-grandparents.
The challenge is availability of materials to promote reading in schools in the local languages. So this project, the African Storybook Project, will greatly help to address that challenge.
So if one can provide a way in which authors can take a story that's in one language, translate it, version it into another context and another language, you immediately are creating a large number of stories for kids that they can identify with.
From one story, you seed potentially in 3 pilot countries, another 12 in South Africa, another 50 in Uganda, another 60 in Kenya.
The way that the Storybook Project began really was when Dorcas Wepakulu from Turkana, Kenya, came to Boston and began to really push me on how we were going to get materials for her students who had nothing to read. The complaint everywhere I've ever worked is, how could I teach children to read when they have nothing to read?
Okay, I did want to just be sure to actually have a picture of Juliet Timber. Now, how many people in this room recognize Juliet Timber? Wow, that's pretty amazing. So that just shows what a wonderful impact Juliet Timber has had. She was a PhD, for those who don't know, she was a PhD student in our department a number of years ago and has returned to Uganda, and of course is doing amazing work in that context, and was instrumental in bringing me on board with the African Storybook Project. So the goal of the African Storybook Project is to create and encourage the use of openly licensed stories for the first few years of reading in digital formats on an interactive website, to enable users to upload, translate, and share versions of the stories in local languages, to provide African children with sufficient familiar language stories for enjoyable reading practice, and to create a firm basis for language and literacy development. So what we have here, why now? What has happened with the African Storybook Project is the planets lining up in many ways. So what you have is a remarkable team at the South African Institute for Distance Education, who is running the project. You have Comic Relief, which has been very generous in its funding of this long-term project. And you have the digital revolution, which means that one can scale up activities. I was just at a workshop for ID, the International Development Research Network here at UBC just last week, and there were many different projects, small projects that are happening in different parts of the world to do with development, but the issue is scalability. So how can we scale up these projects in meaningful ways? And the digital revolution has enabled us to actually scale up this project in highly innovative and important ways. We also are focusing on 3 countries as pilot sites, South Africa, Kenya, and Uganda. But I want to bring to your attention here, what is the language situation? Here in Canada, we've got 2 official languages and, of course, many heritage languages. But in Uganda, there are over 40 languages in the country. In Kenya, over 60. In South Africa, 11 official languages. English is the official language in all these 3 sites, and all examinations for kids are in English. But the mother tongue of the vast majority of kids in Uganda and Kenya and South Africa is not English, and yet they are examined in this language. So you can see the complexity that we are dealing with here. So far, we have managed to get from original 120 stories, we have now are ready to publish 649 digital stories on this interactive website. As you can see, the number of languages in Uganda and a number in Kenya, and of course a number in South Africa as well. So that is really quite remarkable. So where do we get our stories from? From published stories that are available freely, donated stories, stories from web research, stories collected in pilot countries, from folktale versionings, illustrations, and from courses that we run, and from that develop other stories. It is important to note that on the website we have local languages and English, so all the stories are available in at least, of course, one local language as well as English, so that other people can translate from English to other languages. So that's a very important focus, that we can take languages and then translate it into many, many other languages. We're also working with partners like Prof Books. Some people might be familiar. It's a very influential NGO in India, and they've donated a number of books to the project. And what you see here is that we recognize, we acknowledge then the Indian copyright as well as the African Storybook. Although these materials are all open access, we do acknowledge local authorships by the authors themselves. So where does research come in here? So what the African Storybook Project wants to do is to link up with key universities and teacher training institutions. And that is where we come in at UBC. So the question arises is why UBC? And I've been very fortunate over many years to be working with a remarkable group of scholars here, and some of whom are with us today. My colleague Maureen Kendrick, and there we have Margaret Early, have been working with me for a number of years in East Africa in particular, and amazing, just wonderful work that we've done with a host of graduate students, many of whom we've trained at the PhD level and at the master's level. There we have Juliet Timber, and many who have gone back to Uganda and East Africa, and as I say, are making a huge difference in their communities. And in many ways, this image captures the metaphor for our project, which is the fact that the digital means a great deal to people in Africa, even if there are low resources and few resources. And what you see here is a clay keyboard that has been made by local people in fact, northwestern Uganda. And they're not making little clay animals, they're making clay keyboards. And they say, when the digital revolution comes to Arua, we will be ready. So we will have trained ourselves with the use of the computer. So just to show you what kind of interest and investment there is in the digital. So we've also at UBC been very interested in issues of policy and practice, and that is a very important part of educational research. So this picture, for example, was taken at a meeting with the Ugandan Ministry of Education. That was just under 2 years ago. Here we have Sam Mandema, our PhD student, who's just about to finish, giving a talk at a conference. And I will point out Code in the background, because that's an NGO here in Canada that's very interested in literacy in the developing world, and they're very supportive of the African Storybook Project and also a partner. Of course, we're working in remote areas, and there we have Maureen up in northern Uganda. But we also have, of course, the team keeps growing and changing. So we now have people who are more actively involved in the African Storybook Project. There we have Espen Stranger Johansson, who's here today, and Marlene Aslan, who's doing wonderful work with her colleagues in Ethiopia. So how we kick-started this relationship, this research relationship, was through a war colloquium abroad that took place in Stellenbosch, South Africa, at our partner institute, which was the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies. And in fact, that's exactly where Janice Sarah is right now, which is why she's not able to be with us today. And we had an amazing meeting with 40 scholars from different parts of Africa. And there we have Juliet Timber again, and George Openjuru, who's on the Research Advisory Board, Maston Prinsloo as well, also on the Research Advisory Board, and Judith Baker, who is the Literacy Advisor on the project. So we had a very exciting meeting. And as a result of that, we are developing the African Storybook Research Network. And Espen is, in fact, the webmaster of this amazing network. And you'll see here that the mantra here is digital storytelling for multilingual literacy development. And there is that notion that kids in Africa want to be multilingual and multiliterate. So while kids definitely want to be literate in the mother tongue, they also need to be literate in English or French, because these are official languages and the languages in which they are assessed as they grow older. So the goals of the African Storybook Research Network is to develop and nurture a community of scholars, both established and emerging, with interests in the ASP, to disseminate open access publications and resources that might be helpful to the ASREN and ASP community, to inform the community of events and opportunities that might support the research network, projects and programs, and to maintain productive relationships with teachers, parents, librarians, and policymakers. We've also set up a research advisory committee. I'm chairing that committee, and it's an international committee with colleagues in Africa as well as in the UK. So what are some of the questions for research? And as Prof mentioned, I do a lot of work in identity. And one of the challenges is if you work on a series of ideas in one context, the question is, do these ideas travel to other contexts? And how do they travel? Or how are they informed by other contexts? And how are they enriched by those contexts? One set of questions I have is, how is learner and teacher identity implicated in the writing, reading, and sharing of digital stories? And what or whose investments are at stake in schools, homes, and communities? And what I want to do is to have a little conversation between some of the research that I've done over the years here in Canada and the international community, and the research that we anticipate doing for the African Storybook Project. So if you think about the notion of identity, I use the term identity to reference how a person understands his or her relationship to the world, how that relationship is structured across time and space, and how the person understands possibilities for the future. So if, for example, here we have an image of a young woman in Uganda, she has one set of identities as a student. But if you put a video camera in her hand, she shifts her identity and she becomes a photographer, she becomes a journalist. And that gives her a different set of power, set of power relations in relation to her community. And as a result, for example, she can go into a police commissioner's office. And normally, in Uganda, kids would never go into a police commissioner's office. But with that camera in her hand, she goes in as a photographer, as a journalist, and she gets taken seriously. And so this is how the digital can shift people's identities, even in the poorest communities in the world. I've also developed a construct called investment. And what I argue is that the sociological construct of investment is a construct that signals the complex relationship between language learner identity and language learner commitment. In other words, a learner may be a highly motivated language learner, but may nevertheless have little investment in the language practice of a given classroom or community. Which means that you need to ask perhaps a different set of questions. You may ask, are students motivated to read digital stories? Are teachers motivated to teach digital stories? But in addition to that, it may be useful to ask, are students and teachers invested in digital stories and digital literacy practices? And the issue here is, what does it mean for student and teacher identity? And to what extent, in fact, are digital stories identity texts? And this is the work of Jim Cummins and Margaret Earley. So we've worked here with students, we've worked with teachers, we've worked with kids who are helping other kids, and you'll notice here we see solar panels, which are forms of, in a sense, hybrid technologies that will help us access power. And the central findings that we have had is that the digital expands the range of identities available to students. So how do we expand the range of identities, the imagined identities of students in these communities? Just listen to what Theo has to say. I want to spread technology about over the village, and then if time goes on, even the world in general, because there are many of people in our villages that don't know about using the computer, and they cannot read. But if I train them how to use the computer, you never know they can use it. So what these kids are seeing themselves as being trainers and teachers in their communities, these are part of their imagined identities to basically transform their worlds. And in the African Storybook Project, some of the questions we ask, to what extent do images scaffold reading in the ASP stories? Because we're dealing here with a slightly younger group of students. So if, for example, you look at the text here, a long time ago, 3 girls went out to collect wood. When they had collected enough wood, they tied it into bundles and put it on their heads. So for young kids, it's easier to simply say, a long time ago, 3 girls went out to collect wood. But then the image, of course, has the bundles of wood on the young girls' heads. And you can imagine teachers and parents scaffolding this understanding. Multimodality is very important, and my colleague Maureen Kendrick does a lot of very interesting work in this area. The relationship between images and text. So here we have, for example, one of the boys longed to go into the sunlight, and there you have the image, right? What does it mean to go into the sunlight? And actually, this is a text that was donated by Alexander McCall Smith. Some of you might know him from the Ladies First Detective Agency. One of the books he donated was called Children of Wax. Wonderful story. So then you kind of go back and I have a look at some of the research that I've done with Archie Comics here, and it's all on my website, because I was very intrigued by what kids found interesting in Archie Comics. And this is what they had to say. Can Archie Comics help as a literacy tool? They said, yeah, because they use quite easy words that you could learn in school that could help you, and then as you grow older, you could learn harder words by yourself. So you see, kids are scaffolding their learning. They've got pictures can help them, colorful pictures to help the readers to understand, like what is happening, going on. So again, you see that multimodality in work. And I love this final comment. The stuff that I did was I first looked at the pictures and then I made up my own words. So very interesting, the sense of ownership here. And began to talk about the constructs of reading. And look at what I find very interesting what this student had to say. When he contrasted what it means to read for fun and what it means to read for studying. He says, I read them, comics, for fun, not to study. But if I meant to reading it studying, then books like on David that look at the dictionaries and stuff. But these, if I don't know what the words from here, I just go on because I read them for fun. So what you are seeing here is, in a sense, distinctions between kind of fun reading and then legitimate reading. And then legitimate reading is you've got to use the dictionary. Right? You don't understand a word, then you've got to read the dictionary. So you can see it's the construct of reading word by word by word, whereas what this student is saying is, when I read for fun, then in a sense I'm engaging very differently with the text. So what we're looking at here is reading as meaning making. We're looking at the centrality of ownership of meaning. What does it mean to be a reader for these young students in Africa? And it kind of takes me back to the Education for All Global Monitoring report, when they report that 1/4 of those aged 15 to 24 in poor countries are unable to read a single sentence. So I have to ask myself, I wonder what construct of reading, because it looks as though, in a sense, can you read a sentence, like word by word? So is it in a sense, promoting the view of reading as basically something that a functional view of reading, you're reading word by word, rather than engaging in a meaningful way with text? So if you look, for example, at one of our students in Uganda, I was talking to Shelley Jones, who also now, by the way, is in the Khan Institute and connecting with the project. Shelley said, do you learn more by studying English or by communicating in English? Rosita says, communicating. Why? Because when you communicate, you think your own English. So when we're talking about ownership, right, we want students to have a sense of ownership of reading and the identity of the reader. But of course we have challenges, suitable content. What content do we use and who decides? For example, here from Nozebele and the Three Hares, then the dog said, sleep with me. I've never slept with a dog before, said Nozebele. Sleep with me or I'll bite you, said the dog. So Nozebele slept with the dog. And sometimes, of course, when we go back and have a look at our Goldilocks and the Three Bears, we also have troubling images as well. And how do these ideas translate to different contexts? Is this children's literature? The man sped home, picked up a knife, pounced on his wife, and the breast was off instantly. Now, you have to remember that when you have an interactive website, of course, people are downloading stories, but then, of course, they are also going to be contributing stories, and we want people to contribute stories to this website because that's how the website will grow and we'll be able to get more and more stories. But what happens when stories are uploaded that may be uncomfortable or disturbing? So these are some of the issues that we are addressing. Of course, much of the material comes from rural communities where a lot of the stories have been orally told. So it does raise the question, here you have an oral story, and now you have it in picture form. How does that meaning shift in those different genres? What about stories that get lost in translation? I dance when I'm happy, I dance when I'm sad, I dance when I'm lonely, I dance when I'm mad. So lovely rhythmic story. Then it gets translated into Lesotho, which is a Ugandan language, which I don't know myself. But then when you have the literal translation of the Lesotho language, you see dancing is very good, dancing is so amusing, it amuses so many people, even when someone is annoyed. So again, you see the shifts and how do we navigate these? Ownership and access. Now, I've talked about ownership of meaning, right? But there's also the ownership of the text itself. And how do we deal with that when, of course, people are donating stories and don't want those stories appropriated by others in inappropriate ways? And so we make sure that all the authors are acknowledged and all the authors retain copyright of their texts. And we do also recognize clearly that with these texts, it's not only the writer that's important, but also the illustrator that's important. And we're working very actively with Creative Commons license. Pedagogy for social change is something that is very close to my heart. And so the question is, how do we support teachers, parents, and communities to use digital stories effectively? And how do we mediate digital stories with children? And we're going to, Espen Stranger Johannesson and I are going to begin this research, collaborative research, which it's going to begin in June 2014. And we're going to be grappling, as you saw with that data, very troubling data about the lack of success of kids in schools. Educational research is not just about observing what is happening and commenting on what didn't work. Action research is also about how do we try and make things happen? How do we try and make a difference to our research? So we don't just sit in the back of a classroom saying, this didn't work, but we work with teachers in meaningful ways. And in fact, I've got one of my colleagues, Colleen Tuhi, has done a lot of work with teachers here in the Greater Vancouver area and have developed methodologies of working actively with teachers for social change. And we'll be drawing on those methodologies in this research. So what does it mean for the future? We are launching the interactive website in Pretoria, South Africa, in June 2014. You can imagine there's been a huge amount of work involved in getting this website up and running, dealing with copyright issues, dealing with translation issues. That is being supported by the European Union, and Espen, I know, is going to be there. I myself am running an African Storybook workshop here at the Peter Wall Institute on June 26th. And what we want to do is to build on what is learnt at the launch and also to harness local talent and interest. And I see here somebody from Africa Awareness I saw earlier, and the Caribbean African Society here, and UBC Go Global is here. And many people on the UBC campus have demonstrated an interest in this project, but also in the wider community. I was contacted by Translators Without Borders just a couple of weeks ago, and very interested in getting involved. And in fact, Laurie Sick, who's the founder, is currently in Kenya at the moment, connecting with our colleagues in Kenya. We want to develop the African Storybook Research Network, and we're getting there, but we need to obviously get materials up. We want to make sure that we have open access materials on that website, strengthen that community, share resources across that community, and help one another with our research. And we want to strengthen partnerships in Africa and the global community. So in conclusion, lots of wonderful, exciting possibilities with this research. Obviously promoting literacy in sub-Saharan Africa, but with partners, we hope in very meaningful ways, encouraging local ownership of meaning, because we see that this is very important to learning. And I see this very important to democratize the flow of ideas through sharing the ASB early literacy model to other regions of the world. I was just in Australia and New Zealand a couple of months ago, and the people and colleagues in New Zealand were very excited by this model and said, well, you know, when it gets up and running, share it with us, because we have many indigenous languages that we would like to have incorporated on a website to promote literacy in that context. And I'm sure that this would be true in many contexts. And of course, here, even in Canada, although we might only have 2 official languages, we have many heritage languages. And many kids from many different parts of the world are wanting to maintain those heritage languages. So to what extent might this model actually be relevant to the local contexts? We, of course, are having a huge amount of fun, which is wonderful in research, because we do work 24/7. And of course, I have a wonderful team that is working with me. So thank you very much, everybody.